Hey everyone, Sean Maloney, Digital Business Masters. Another DBM strategy call. End of June 2025 already. An amazing year we're having. And it's a case of making sure that sometimes we just take a step back and remember why we are here, what we've achieved, and what we've still yet to achieve as we ride the system now, as opposed to being used by the system, which all started with that gentleman in the picture there back in 1971. So I picked up some information this week actually from Bitcoin Prague. We watched some presentations and we had some interesting presentations going back to the effects of what 1971 has done to society. Obviously, there's plenty of good things going on. Okay, no problem. There's plenty of good things that have happened since 1971, but they can be so much better for so many more people if they appreciated what we appreciate and in fact have done. And the whole premise of the DBM Academy is to highlight what's happened in the past, focus on where we are today, and set a trajectory so that we can predict the future by creating the future. And we don't just talk about that anymore. We actually do it in real time, and we do it in some very clever ways. You do have to understand the big picture before you can put in the application to convert realization and education into reality in your life. So there's two parts to this update every week. There's part one, which we'll do full live in front of you right now. And then part two, you'll see the link below this video to access the updates as to how we convert this knowledge into practical action. And something we've done now for well over a decade. Okay, it's actually getting easier to pull this off, which is why we're so excited about it. On that regard, we're not here to give any advice. Okay, we're not designed for financial advice. We're not qualified for the financial advice. And that is in the sense of the traditional fiat TradFi advice system. Yeah, they've set up many, many years ago, as you'll pick up, predominantly since 1971, lots and lots of rules, lots and lots of ways, lots and lots of smoke and mirrors, lots and lots of fiscal and monetary experimentation that they've wrapped up in complexity. So it makes people feel unworthy and unable and no confidence. Okay, so financial advisors and bank managers and bosses and governments and institutions step into that void, and they frighten people in terms of having adult conversations about financial steps by saying that, you know, you must be qualified as an advisor. Okay, well, in case you haven't noticed, that's not working very well for the majority of people. So this day and age, with the opening up of the internet, the communications age, and blockchain, we're able to combine the very best of those things, including AI these days, and convert an education premise so that we're always seeking financial education, not always seeking financial advice. And we just sit in that realm at DBM Academy because we simply move ourselves into position to prove something. We then try to make things better and improve as we go as best we can. Obviously, you know, these things have to be tested out. And it's not always a straight line, but we're continually progressing. And then we help other people just follow what we've done. That's really all it's about. Why is that so important? Well, because as we've found, and we've known this for a long, long time as individuals, but the vast majority of people, as you talk to friends, family, and associates, they won't understand what the wealthy actually do in terms of living their lifestyles. And what I mean by that is the vast majority of people are taught, encouraged, and educated to go out there and exchange skill and time for income in the form of currency, and then use that to directly acquire liabilities. Now, there's nothing wrong with that on the face of it until you get to the point in time where you realize that you're chasing and chasing and chasing and sacrificing and even adjusting life expectation because you've just simply not got enough currency, despite having the skill, despite putting the time in, despite working hard, despite putting everything in that you're asked to put in. There comes a point in life where you're realizing you've just not got enough. And that is nothing to do with you and your lack of skill or time or ability or work ethic. That's everything to do with the devaluing nature of the currency you're exchanging those elements for. So what the wealthy do is they recognized a long time ago, obviously, if you've read the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book or the Cash Flow Quadrant, both by Robert Kiyosaki, you'll realize what you do is you take the elements of time, effort, energy, work ethic, and convert the currency that those things give you into the acquisition of assets. And those assets do two things. They appreciate, and once you get really good at it, you're able to identify aspects of asset allocation that also cash flows. We call it critical mass. You build enough assets up to create a situation where the balance sheet, the asset base, is constantly utilized and reutilized to create cash flow, and you use that cash flow to fund liabilities. That's the big difference. That's the premise that we stand by at DBM and have done for many years. And the point is, well, how's that done? Well, there's a million and one ways of doing that, right? I mean, most people will jump out of bed and decide, I'm going to set up a business. I'm going to create value for other people. I'm going to find problems that other people want solving, and people are going to pay me for that. And then in time, the business becomes big enough for it to become its own, reallocation system, a balance sheet and a profit and loss account. And you bounce the two off each other all the time. That's what most people do. And many people inside the DBM have done that. Well, I've done that. You set businesses up with property businesses, you've got factory businesses, you've got, marketing solutions businesses. And what we figured out just over a decade ago is that actually, yeah, that's okay. You can do that. And there's a reason not many people do it, because it's not easy, right? Most people are employed inside those type of mechanisms, which leaves them on the top of that prior slide. But what we figured out about a decade ago is, hang on a minute, so that's fine. And we can do that in small areas of local geography. And obviously we can expand if we're really good and take our products and services globally, especially these days with the internet. But what would it be if we could put a proportion of our business, which these days they call a Bitcoin treasury, but what would it be if we could take a proportion of our business and allocate some of our capital flows into the ownership of assets that cash flow and put that onto decentralized, connected, blockchain-based assets that everybody has on their balance sheet in some way, shape, or form, right? And when I say everybody, it's barely 1 million wallets at the moment, but that is a huge number of people when you compare it to running a balance sheet just in one company in one local area that has a fixed number of suppliers and customers it can work with. We started to figure out, well, no, hang on a minute. We can actually put on our balance sheet an asset known as Bitcoin that hundreds of thousands of companies have on their balance sheet as well. And then you get into that accretion model. Okay, it's an accretive asset, but it means that as the world moves towards the understanding of what I've said in the last 5 minutes, then as more and more people do that, the demand for that asset, which is in finite supply, means that you've added an asset to your balance sheet that isn't only encumbered by what you do as an individual in your business, right? So we sort of accidentally fell into that because many people who got into Bitcoin in the last decade, they call them, OGs, anybody who started acquiring Bitcoin before 2015, then it was all about, well, a bit speculative, sounds like a good idea, not exactly sure how it works, but let's accumulate anyway, because it seems like it's logical that if it's in finite supply and it's got infinite demand through 8 billion people on the planet, most of whom still don't understand it even in 2025, then let's have a go. So we were doing that up until about 2024, so only very recently. And then all of a sudden it was, now we have this on our balance sheet and we're cash flowing in all these different ways and got profit and loss accounts going through these different business systems, and we're accumulating what we call dollar cost average. Then now we're actually taking full advantage of the fact that we can see huge gains in Bitcoin, as we've seen, 1,000% gain in the last 5 years, and it directly affects our balance sheet. Directly sits on our balance sheet, your balance sheet, every individual who owns Bitcoin balance sheet. Yeah. So the equity element of the one of the three different business models we operate at DBM is profound. And I just thought I'd take a bit more time to explain that this week, because we're now seeing lots of big companies with eye-watering numbers, millions and billions, buying up hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, to do what I've just said. There's little old us in the background, either accidentally or luckily or very smartly, putting ourselves in front of that long before people were doing it in the big public levels that we see today. And bear in mind, these companies have only started being public on this in the past year. The oldest, longest standing company that's been doing this, the most public company since 2020, is Strategy. And this week, Strategy are about to go even more public because they will become part of the S&P. So Bitcoin this week, for the first time, will become an integral part of the normal stock market indirectly through Strategy. What do you think about that? Right? So Bitcoin is profound. Bitcoin we'll keep coming back to, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about Bitcoin because of the reasons I've just explained. But we don't stop there at DBM, because we recognize that you can't run a long-term business just off a balance sheet. You can re-leverage balance sheets. If you're lucky enough to build up a balance sheet, especially one of critical mass, I'll show you in part 2 how we collateralize our Bitcoin permanently to create ongoing working capital that we then reallocate into USDT-based projects and altcoin projects. So why do we do that? Well, we want yield, right? We want a weekly, monthly return for our capital deployed, right? And that's on your profit and loss. That creates the income that covers your costs, pays the bills, that you reallocate a portion back to your balance sheet. We recommend 80-20, and you move forward with your business until your business is big enough to pay you a good enough income, a wage, a director's loan account, so that you can live your life off your business. You've got to build your business first, right? So we do all sorts of things in that regard. Is that easy? Definitely not. We've gone in very deep on several projects because we understand the need for it. But finding in this early stage, this 5, 6, 7, 8 years of this brand new technology where companies are trying to do the right thing, they're trying to get these things set up, they understand the need, but getting that to sit still and become something we can rely on as opposed to our other business incomes is not easy. Okay, but it doesn't take away the fact that you need that in your business. Right? So what we do is we push through. Altcoins, same type of thing. The difference is that with altcoins, you can get equity and yield, but again, you've got the same challenges, arguably even more challenges. With the right suppliers, with the right relationships, with the right founders, with the right type of clever people around you, you can do very, very well organizing yourself to take the privilege of equity plus yield in the same ecosystem. And we do operate with a project that is the second most valuable digital asset on the planet after Bitcoin in that regard. Yeah, but it's not for the faint-hearted. Yeah, definitely not for the faint-hearted. But for those who are trained and educated and motivated and driven and focused and organized, it's a very, very precious thing to be able to build a P&L off the back of equity plus yield in the same moment. And obviously what we do is we're continually funneling back these high-risk activities back to less risky and much less risky Bitcoin now than we've ever seen in all the years we've been involved. All right. So there's an original digital business plan here that is evolving all the time. And the most successful people inside the DBM community are the ones that keep an eye on every aspect that they've got involved with. Even if they didn't understand this when they got involved, they've taken the time to keep learning and making sure that they finish what they started. So one of the reasons we set the academy side of DBM up about 5 or 6 years ago is because we recognized already then, and we certainly recognize it now, that ordinary people, the retail people we predominantly work with, need support. It's not just about education. Education is absolutely relevant. You've got realization, education, application. But in that education, you've also got the need for a lot of support. So we've been lucky enough to pull around us, like-minded people who are on this journey for themselves, and they want to get started, and they want to help each other, and they want to help others. And that's what we call the DBM coach team. So we have coverage global coverage that allows us to help people, okay? And it's your job to decide, first of all, if you understand what I've been saying for the past 10 minutes, and hopefully you'll understand it even more when I show you the effects of what happened since 1971 in a minute. And then you say, right, well, I'm not willing to put up with this anymore. If not for me, then for my kids and grandkids. I'm going to do something. Now, a lot of people jump in and say, oh, this sounds exciting. I'll throw thousands of dollars at this and it'll just be one and don't press a button. It's going to make me rich forever. Because that's what the marketers will tell you. That's what the financial advisors will tell you. That's what the bosses will tell you. That's what the institutions will tell you. The reality is that you've got to understand the baseline reasons behind what is going on, not just with the digital assets that we happen to leverage in order to make a good living, but also the macro and geopolitical elements that sit behind it. If you want to get as close to the money supply as you can, which is basically what you're doing when you own Bitcoin, for example, especially now, you've really got to understand what's happening next in geopolitics and macroeconomics. And that isn't easy to do on your own. Hence, those of us who are able to do it full time, we study this all the time because we're making decisions in our businesses that are very much now being affected by what's going on with US policy, European policy, global policy, central banking policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy. And we have to understand it because the effects of our decisions are based on what is happening as best as we can interpret as we move forward. And you're never going to get it exact, but you need to know enough about it in order for you to be on the front foot as you go through your quarterly decision making. In fact, in some cases, it's week to week. So that's best served by being part of a system that enables you to plug in and have regular interface with each other. It's not that we've got all the answers, I've got all the answers, the coaches have got all the answers. It's but together we've got some answers that allow us to bounce off each other. And we do that through a process working from mindset, through skills, into systems, which is the application side. Then the income comes. And then if you're good, you'll be able to create wealth, which is ongoing management of income. Now, there's skills gaps all the way across this that many of you won't even understand that you've got a skills gap. Right. And when you face the fact that you have got a skills gap, your first thing you'll do is rebuff against it because you won't want to go out of your comfort zone. You didn't sign up for this. I didn't understand that. I don't want to become a mathematician. I don't understand business. I don't understand spreadsheets. I don't understand cash flows. I don't understand balance sheets. And what you'll do is you'll resist and pull backwards, and that'll manifest itself in the guise of blame and emotion and fight and flight, right? If you want to be successful, you've got to work yourself to a better place as an individual first, and then your business will come. Yeah. So we've set up a structure here that allows you to do that in the very basic levels, hopefully being as affordable as we can possibly make it. And then all the way up to you being, somebody who can look after themselves as a professional business owner. So that's the DBM business model. Now, with all that said, it sits around a global premise that, as you'll see in a minute, because most of us were born into a situation of unmanaged, unfettered, out of control currency management, yeah, and you'll see the consequences of what's happened since 1971 in a minute. Us realizing that, some of us as far back, as we can remember, of course, we've always felt, hang on, something's not right here. Something's not right. It doesn't feel right. The expectations that I was given at some point by parents and bosses and teachers, it's just not right. Now, a lot of us are boomers and Gen X's. And then you've got the millennials and then the Gen Zs. And if you listen to what those guys are talking about, it's even less right. It feels even more weird. But it's bound to. Because since 1971 in particular, we've been pushing forward the debt crises. In other words, the build-up of borrowed funds on our kids' credit cards to live the lifestyle we have today. In fact, worse, living the lifestyles we've had since the 1970s. Yeah. So while we all sit back sometimes and look out in our environments and think, oh, well, I remember when these streets were war-torn. I remember when these streets were, cottage terraces where people were walking into factories. I remember when kids were walking around the streets with no shoes on. I remember when the streets were full of rubbish. I remember when there was no lighting. I remember when, of course, we can look at it like that since the 60s and 70s and 80s. Some of us are old enough to remember that. And you can see that things have improved, but how have they made that improvement? They've borrowed the money. Now, that exploded on itself in what felt like a very big way back in 2008, but in fact was a very, very small warning. And many of us spotted that. Yeah, we were working as hard as we possibly could all the way through the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. We were developing everything we could. We saw all the technology, all the efficiencies, all the automation. I'll show you some charts in a minute. And things were becoming, cheaper and quicker and faster to produce. We had globalization. We had lots of things being exported, which turns out to be exported inflation. Yet the currency we were being paid in was not getting any net benefit from all those improvements. And this is only back in 2008. So many of us is not that long ago, right? And it was that DBM spotted. We still have the businesses we had then, but the businesses were heavily affected. And I personally looked at it and said, there's something not right. Something not right here. I was in my mid-30s at that point. I'm not doing all that again. Just to go through another decade, another boom and bust, where the governments and bosses and banks can say, oh, it's just another recession. It's just natural. Oh, no, it's just inflation. No, I'm not having that. There must be another way. And that's when we tripped up into this concept that calls itself Bitcoin, but it's not Bitcoin. It's sound money. It's monetary energy that interconnects itself on a fixed supply globally. And the sooner people understand that, the sooner you're able to put yourself on the front foot, knowing that the energy that gets produced is the way that you fund your balance sheet to fund your life. And this chart, this image, this slide, is just designed to show you the facts. Yes, in monetary terms, yes, in dollar terms, because that's what we understand. Because we understand dollars and pounds and euros and yens, because that's what we use to interface our lives. But it's not even about that. It's simply a case of making sure that you understand that as more and more and more energy goes into society, which is becoming even more profound over this next 5 years than it has been in the last 5, then you understand that you need to own the central generator. You need to own the nucleus of the activity, which used to be gold, and for a while was the dollar, and now is Bitcoin. Understanding that puts you a decade ahead of your peers. And all we do is ride into that. And all we've done up until recently is take some risks and good faith and resting back on our appreciation of what I've been seeing for the past 15 minutes. And sometimes feeling a little bit nervous about that, sometimes a little bit foolish. And then all of a sudden, it gets recognized by the institutions, the corporations, the big investors, the governments. Just all of a sudden. Now, it wasn't really all of a sudden. Behind the scenes, these guys were doing what they do. They're not stupid. There's a reason they're in those positions, right? But we knew, as individuals, as little old us, we knew because we'd researched it, we'd looked at it, we've analysed it, we've spent time teaching ourselves this stuff while sat in commute traffic, while, walking the dog, while living life. We've figured it out. We've not just decided we need leisure, I need peace, I need music, I need football matches, I need films, I need Netflix. No, we sacrificed that, if that's what you want to use. We determined that over the last decade, we're going to figure this out. And that's exactly what we've done. And now it's payback. That is why we're so passionate about what we do. And we will not stop because we know we're right. We know we're right. In fact, we knew all along, but now we're being vindicated. Very, very powerful. Now, the thing that I wanted to just build that picture is to show you this. This is depressing. This comes with a warning. Many of you listening to this call, like either live or through the YouTube channels, etc., you'll know a lot of this already. But when you look at it in this way, it hits you very, very hard, because everybody listening to this call will have been or is being affected by a lot of the data I'm just about to show you. And it is thoroughly depressing. Thoroughly depressing. But fortunately, as I've said, there's answers, not just for you, but for people around you. It's the consequences of the printing of currency supply 50 years on. Okay? 54 years on, to be precise. It's the consequences of what's happened. Like I say, not that any of us have got anything to complain about necessarily. We're arguably healthier, living longer, etc. Right? But that's not the point. The point is, how has that been funded? And what are the consequences of extended decades of this phenomenon on not so much baby boomers and Gen Xers, but certainly our kids and our grandkids, and certainly their kids? It is pretty depressing. And it's weird, right? In the ironic sense. You'll always see on these slides a little red dotted line that earmarks 1971. Right? And then you'll look at the data as to the consequences of what many of us already know because we live in society. But when you get it thick and fast like this, it hits you between the eyes and it makes you think, something's got to give here. Something's got to give. And I think from 2025 onwards, we're living through something shifting. It's called the fourth turning. And it's long overdue. And fortunately for many of us, we've been ahead of it for many, many years so that we can accelerate and make things better quicker. Even if you're starting today, you can make things better quicker. Whatever you've done, whatever you've been up to, whatever you've not seen, whatever mistakes you've made, even if you start today, you can make this better. Divorce prevalence, we all know that story. Families with children in official poverty. Yeah, it came down, obviously post-war, it came down, and then bang, shoots up. The divorce prevalence with single parents and all the rest of it, the red line, I think most of us understand that, right? Fact is that poverty either hasn't changed or it's got worse for certain parts of society. Percentage of children born to unwed women, okay, just as a marker. I don't think this is necessarily a race issue, but clearly, as you build a society that allocates more free currency into the system in the form of social welfare, people feel less need to team up, right? And you get these dichotomies, whether that's male or female, it doesn't really matter, right? But it just shows the freedoms that people feel, but it's all being funded in ways that aren't sustainable. And even worse, not good for the children. Another consequence of all that, as we all know, is we're in a population crisis in the West. Because what do people do? If they can't afford something, even to get themselves organized. I mean, my kids and their peer groups, certainly, they're coming out of 21, 22 years of age now with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt in the 20s. So how are they supposed to get it from, before you know you've got a mortgage, before you know you got married, before you know you've got all sorts of responsibilities, including children? What are you going to do? Well, you're going to say, I'm going to put it off. I'm going to get a dog. This one's the big one. It's absolutely disgraceful. And this is pure and simply down to the fiat currency system. Right? People feel that they're getting more income in dollar terms, pound terms, euro terms, right? But it's nowhere near the net parity as to what the productivity of the economies are now capable of with technology, automation, robotics, and everything else. Things are getting a lot cheaper to produce, but a lot more dollar expensive to purchase. And that doesn't necessarily mean the companies are making more profits. It's purely to do with the devaluing purchasing power of currency, period. You just have to look at this chart on the right-hand side to see the difference. This is a big, big problem. Again, many of us a little bit older, we look at this and we thank our lucky stars, right? But it's not about us. It's about our next generations. And this is already a generation too late. Yeah. There's kids who are in their 30s now, even into their 40s, who still can't afford to buy, if buying is the right thing to do. We'll have a whole discussion about mortgages if you want. But at the end of the day, the rental markets, which, as we all know, is dead money. And if you're going to look at a house at the end of a term as something that you can put on your balance sheet, which is a debatable topic, but that's for another day. But either way, it's still a goal in Western societies to own a property, a home. What's wrong with that, right? But in terms of home value compared to income change, there's just no comparison. The white line of the value of the home, which isn't the price of the home, isn't the value of the home, it's the price of the home. And the price of the home is only higher, not because the value of the home is more, but because the devaluing nature, it takes more dollars, more pounds, more euros to buy the same thing in real time. And look at the flat line of income change. In fact, it's negative, actually. This is a consequence of 1971, right? Isn't it weird? Well, no, not really. And then how long does it say? Those of you who've got teenagers and teenage grandkids, you'll know. This is crazy. This is crazy. Oh, nearly 7 or 8 years now. Years to save up just to get on the ladder. Which all goes back to the same premise. It's nothing to do with the value of the purchase. It's taking more dollars, more energy, more effort to get to the same place that many of us got to 3 or 4 decades ago for a lot less in real terms compared to income, the ability to earn in equivalent currency. Because what did they do in 1971? They opened all the floodgates up, all the derivative markets opened up. They simply were able to print. The government saw it as a complete gift horse. They're addicted to it. They'll continue to print. And we'll talk in a minute what's going on in macro and geopolitical shenanigans, especially in Europe right now. And you'll see that it's only going to get worse. And then you hit the health side of stuff, which is the really depressing stuff. I didn't realize they had obese toddlers in America, but apparently they do, which is absolutely crazy. But the end of the day, this is down to lesser quality food, let's put it that way. Cheaper food, faster food that people just need, there's no choice but to eat because they can't afford anything else. And that is a pure symptom of the market meeting the market. So the suppliers meeting the market, because the suppliers, the farmers, the producers, they can't afford to produce quality. So they'll produce what they can, knowing that the consumers can't afford the quality anyway. They can barely afford to buy the crap. Which is why now in 2025, you've even got food on platforms like Klarna where you can put it on the Never Never. You can get your food on a payment plan because people are that stretched. That's just one up from people queuing up in Mercedes and BMWs to go to the local food bank. There's more food banks in the area I live in than there's ever been. People are now looking for gifted food because they can't afford to buy even crap food. And all the food bank's food is crap. This is all because of 1971. Isn't it weird? And then the money shot. Again, US data, but it stands in Europe as well. The population, yes, of course, steady incline in population, of course, but look at the price, look at the cost. Look at the cost of healthcare on a individual level. Now, there's a whole ream of discussions around this, but the premise still goes back to the same point. Because there's no value in the currency, because there's no sound money, they print, it devalues 7 to 10% per year. They need to print more, as we'll show you now. They're just about to do in big ways. We now understand how that gives us an advantage, which isn't actually the answer. What we have to do is what we have to do in the short term. And then we can try and shift the entire thing so that we get to a position of reset, rebalancing the economies and getting to a point whereby these costs of staying healthy come down, not because necessarily the medicine at the end of the problem, fixing the problem isn't the answer, it's preventing the problem. And the big reason the problem exists is the crap that people are eating, because they can't afford quality. They can't afford quality lifestyles, right? That's the unwritten death by 1,000 cuts, not seen problem. Not the nicer cars, the lit streets, the more secure, the cleaner places, all this veneer. Yes, everything looks more sophisticated and clever, and people can fly all over the world and whatever, and fancy televisions and everything. No, that's a veneer. Underneath it is a problem. And the problem's only going to be fixed by you as an individual. It's not going to get fixed by anybody else, not in the short term. Okay? And then the very end of the cycle, of course, what are people going to do if they're desperate, despondent, disenfranchised? They're going to cause trouble. These people aren't necessarily bad people. They become bad people because they're told they're bad, especially when they end up being incarcerated. But the reason, especially the male populations, obviously, are in this increased rate of incarceration and population increase is because they are at the end of their tether. And it's all gone up since 1971, and despite being flatlined for generations before. Isn't that weird? No, it's not weird. All right. So let's just have a quick look at the positives, because that's depressing, right? That is the foundation of the motivation as to why we do what we do. And we've known about that for well over a decade. We understood fiat currency well over a decade ago, and most people in the world still don't understand fiat currency. But fiat currency, full fiat, is what was unleashed onto the populations in 1971, August 1971, to be precise. Now, most of us didn't understand anything since then. We've grown up, we've lived our lives, we've got married, had kids, and got to a point in time where it's like, no, something's not right. Something's going to have to give. Unfortunately, thanks to the internet, we were able to connect with each other and start to figure out things needed to change, and put on top of that a internet-based, blockchain-based super system that allows us to take ownership of something that is the closest thing to sound money that the world has ever known, let alone our generation, let alone the time we actually happen to exist. It is the closest thing that mankind has ever done to get to sound money. Unfortunately, for many of us in the DBM community, we've been accumulating that premise. Now it's a case of stop taking that position, stop taking where you're at with whatever you've been up to as we try to find these solutions. Whatever that level is you're at, is then looking at that in the round and saying, right, in mid-2025, this is where I'm at. I've learned a lot. I've got where I am where I am. And now I'm going to push forward under not just a whole load of realization about 1971, a whole load of realization since 2008, a whole load of realization of what you've been doing maybe for the past 4, 5, 6, 7 years. You've now got the tailwinds of macroeconomics and government policy in order for you to make the next 5 years, or even shorter if you're really good, something that you can be generationally influential on. That has to be the focus. With all that bad news and all that evidence and all that data and all that realization of why we live where we live. Now what? Now what? Well, every week we sit down and we go through macroeconomics, the updates, and geopolitics. And every week, literally every week, we inch a little bit closer to having a formula, having a structure, having a business model that allows us to inch forward the goal that we have, which is nothing more complicated on wanting to protect our purchasing power, not just in the rest of our lifetimes, but for the lifetimes of our kids and grandkids. We just inch closer and closer and closer to it. And we have the privilege of being able to just sit down and think about that once a week. Even if, just listening to this call. Yeah, if you're professional, you'll be doing this full time and you'll be looking at this very deeply because this creates your strategies. That's what we talk about in the workspace. That's what we talk about in the DBM Hub. That's why you've got to move up the channels and get yourself plugged in because you'll recognize this. It becomes a way of life. It doesn't become just an ambition or a hope or something I'll put some money out and press a button. Hopefully it'll sort my income out. No, it's not about the income. It's about understanding how to manage the income. And the macro stuff is just making it easy for us to see every single week if you have the right mindset. We have some people in the community, it's like, oh, I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about macroeconomics. I don't want to think about politics. Well, if you want to be close to the money supply, you have no choice. Now, you don't have to be as close to it as we are. That's why we provide the service we provide. But you do have to take account of these points as they come through, which is why I'm listing them and I go through them as quickly as I can. But they're very important to understand, and you'll pick up different bits that resonate with you, and you'll be able to go away and study it for a couple of hours and say, right, what's he meant by that? What did he mean by that? Especially now I've got AI. And then you come back and talk to other people who are on the same journey as you, and you move together forwards, and you can build up enough over time, critical mass, create the balance sheet, drive that into income perpetually. And how do we know it works? Well, we know it works because we do it every day. Those of us who built the critical mass make a living off this. This is what we do. What we earn out the academy and the income out of other value-added services is just sideline stuff, right? The company is run off the balance sheet. So it's interesting data. 566 Bitcoin now held on what are called ancient wallets. So these are wallets that are over 10 years old. The beautiful thing about Bitcoin is you can analyze every single transaction across the whole planet on the blockchain and see exactly where things are at. 566 wallets just last week tipped over the daily issuance of Bitcoin that comes out every single day. That's an important number because what you've got there is a supply shock building. The reason we've got price sideways activity, even though we're not complaining at price sideways over $100,000 per Bitcoin, we'd have dreamt about that just last year. We're sideways tracking at the moment because a lot of people who've owned Bitcoin over 10 years are taking some profit out, and good for them. Good for them. That's being purchased up by the ETFs and everything else, which is why the price is going sideways. But there won't be many more people, as you can see, that are willing to sell the Bitcoin. Not many more wallets that are going to be willing to sell the Bitcoin, which is why you've got record low exchange levels of Bitcoin, record low levels on OTC of Bitcoin. What does that tell us, knowing what's coming next, as we'll talk about in the political section, about price? You've got all these soft signals. The Fed officially last week, character Powell in the Fed, he's on borrowed time, that guy, but even he's now relinquishing, officially ending reputational risk and oversight, easing Bitcoin and crypto banking regulations. Banks can now directly sell Bitcoin to their customers in America. I never thought I'd be saying that. Yeah. All the idiots, all the grandmas, the old people are in Europe at the moment. We'll talk about that in a minute. Texas last week just approved its $10 million worth of get itself on the train of Bitcoin as a state-owned strategic reserve. One of the first states to do it. The states are running faster than the Fed. They're running faster than the federal side of the US, which is just a consequence of the government structure that the US has. It's light years ahead of Europe, but it's way behind Russia and India and China because they have different political ways of working, right? The US government allows Bitcoin and crypto holdings to be considered when assessing mortgage finance eligibility. That is now ticked, signed off, done. US Director of Housing last week. This is again in the US. It'll come everywhere else because of the US. Imagine that. Yeah. Now we're cute enough and sophisticated enough, and we understand enough to know, as professional digital asset owners, that we're never going to give our crypto over to a bank to underwrite a borrowing to buy a property. Why would we do that? We do it for ourselves, as I'll show you in part 2. Yeah, we know full well how to have our cake and eat it without ever giving our Bitcoin to anybody else. But the fact is that Joe Sixpack, Mrs. Housewife, they'll absorb that and say, oh, whoopie-doo. I can now get hold of some Bitcoin 5-10 years from now. My kids are going to be able to buy a property just because they bought Bitcoin in 2025. They're going to be able to get a significant part of the property purchased, probably outright, because of the decisions that the parents and more established kids made now. The best decisions are made today. The second best decisions are made best decisions were made 20 years ago, right? Fidelity is still on the train, another 1,000 and odd Bitcoin purchased last week. Yeah, below that, you've got Goldman Sachs now jumping on the train as well. These are big institutions. Don't underestimate these guys. It's all about front running. It's all about all this stuff coming out in the mainstream media. It's all we really need. It's happening. So we just have to follow it through now. Gaming companies, Aura, put 20% of their cash reserves onto Bitcoin every single week. More and more and more Bitcoin treasuries going into these companies. Pompliano there, ProCap, made a big, I don't know if you follow Anthony on X or he's on YouTube, I think he is. $392 million Bitcoin reserve gone in like that. That came out of the blue. ProCap is just copying strategy. It's copying, what's going on with the Japanese, etc. So it's just more and more and more headlines. And Mike Saylor, as I said earlier, with his strategy company, just days away. In fact, it may well happen today that they qualify for the S&P. It's qualified for the S&P, and that'll move forwards. Now, that's more bullish headlines, more in your face, more people getting confident, more people becoming aware that Bitcoin is here and it's here to stay. But moreover, it's sound money. It's monetary energy here to stay. It's got nothing to do with Bitcoin. It's to do with what it represents. Just as a heads up, we're watching Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Sol from this week. Okay, now we've been watching Bitcoin forever. Ethereum's been through a little bit of a doldrum, but it's coming back big guns if you're keeping an eye on what's going on with the institutions. They're buying up Ethereum for fun at the moment, so they know something we don't. Okay, or even if they're buying into something that they don't fully understand yet, it doesn't really matter when it comes to price discovery. Right, so if you've already got ETH, many of you are buying up ETH at $55, $120, $500. It's $2,500 today, right? We just accumulate, and we put it onto whatever we need to put it. And Sol as well, relatively new kid on the block. I don't know if you're listening to the coaches and you're listening to what the coaches get up to, you'll know Sol has been part of what they've been talking about for some time. All bullish. Fed Chair Powell banks can now work in the Bitcoin industry. I've mentioned that before. He's finished, right? But it's not about what he says anymore. It's about where the Fed are at. And most importantly, it's about who's coming behind him next. Remember, the markets work about 3 to 6 months into the future. So this is where you're going to see these big pumps coming out in the next half of this calendar year. Trump's Truth Social files to officially launch its own ETF on the New York Stock Exchange. Okay, so whatever you think about families and Trump, or it doesn't really matter. What matters is the movement of this industry into the highest levels. As I mentioned before, Bitcoin exchanges have an all-time low when it comes to Bitcoin supply. Bitcoin in corporate Bitcoin adoption, 9 institutions have collectively added nearly 12,000 Bitcoin to their coffers just in this recent period. That's 9 institutions now. Yeah, building up every day. Next week it'll be 11, then it'll be 15, then it'll be 20. I think we said last week by this time next year, you're looking at 70 plus treasury. This is publicly traded companies with Bitcoin treasuries, 70 plus. That's all we really need to know. Yeah, you might not agree with it, you might not like it, you might have all sorts of opinions about purism and Bitcoin maximalism. Fine, have your opinions. All that matters at this juncture in 2025 is to have enough of something in sound money terms to protect your own purchasing power for the rest of your life and to make sure you're looking after the people who come after you. That's all that really matters. Hong Kong approves the first mainland broker to sell. This is a backdoor into China, obviously. China's bending the knee. It's allowed Hong Kong to do that. They're not stupid. This will unlock billions. Yeah, it was only a couple of years ago that China banned blockchain and crypto entirely, Bitcoin entirely. It was only a couple of years ago. Look how quickly, how fickle they are. You can't stop the train. Bitcoin separates money from state, that's for sure. yeah, in its purest form. And that's where we still focus. Okay. You've got your Bitcoin and the stock market's coming together. Okay. Like I say, it's all a means to an end if you're going to look at it like as a business person. Okay. But they're very different thing. Owning pure Bitcoin and owning ETF Bitcoin are two totally different things. You can have either you want. It's like I've said over the years with gold. You can go and buy gold ETFs if you want, but you're buying a piece of paper. You're better off with the actual asset. And that's not for everybody because it needs full sovereignty, full security, full responsibility, all the stuff I've been talking about. It's not for everybody, and that's okay. That's okay. But if you're going to dabble over there and put your assets in other people's hands, just know that they're in other people's hands. BlackRock still driving hard on the 340 million Bitcoin. Okay, now just over 3,200 Bitcoin, nearly 700,000 Bitcoin now. They only started a couple of years ago, quietly to start with, right? And now thinks I'm banging every drum, every YouTube channel you'll find him talking about it because he wants to set his legacy, right? He won't be there much longer either. Publicly traded companies on their balance sheets have doubled. Like I said before, this is something we're tracking very carefully. We reckon it'll be 70 of these companies over the next 12 months. MasterCard have always been behind the scenes, as have Visa with regards to crypto. Okay. But they're now officially allowing, as if we need any freaking allowance, but allowing its 3.5 billion users to buy Bitcoin and crypto directly through. So that's interesting. Now, many of us have known the rules over the years, 5 exchanges, 5 off and on ramps. We've had to do that because the banks, whether you're in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, UK, US, the banks, and still to this day, are sticky, very difficult to work with. Not because they're trying to protect you, because they don't want you moving and becoming your own bank. We all know that, right? But your average Joe Soap doesn't. But now MasterCard are starting to bring all these things through. The banks are going to have to relinquish. In fact, they already are. So I'm not saying that makes our lives any easier. You should still be looking at keeping below the radar, in my opinion, just at this stage. Okay. But just know that things are going to become a lot easier. What does that do? It makes our lives easier, obviously, professional digital asset managers. But most of all, it means all the people who don't know what you know are going to be getting involved with this asset class, which only has one effect, obviously. Okay. And interestingly, strategy, keeping an eye on strategy today, like I say, it's likely they're going to be going forward into the S&P publicly, but already just in the last 5 years, they've now got 21.3 billion in unrealized profits on Bitcoin that they've been accruing at dollar cost averaging since 2020. Astonishing, right? Obviously gone in big guns. They've gone in with lots and lots of ways to fund that. All we do is watch it as individuals and say, well, obviously I'm going to put billions and millions into Bitcoin acquisition, but what I can do is put $10 a week in. And you're just tracking a slipstreaming strategy. It's just become faster. That's why we're over 100,000 now. Whereas back when these guys started buying it, and many of you guys may have started buying Bitcoin, it was 20,000. It's 1,000% up since 2020. All we had to do was dollar cost average. Okay. We've disconnected with the M2 money supply at the moment, if you've noticed, right? So that's just like a coiled spring. It's just a coiled spring. I've explained the reasons why we think that Bitcoin's going sideways, and that's a good thing because it gives us more time to breathe and take account of what we need to do to do whatever you need to do to build your balance sheet. Go and get a paper round if you have to. But at the end of the day, it's given us more time to log dollar cost average at these levels. And as we'll talk about in part 2, if you're managing your collateral and managing your reallocations, you can build up a bit of a pot ready to go back in again, obviously, as the price increases. So that's very important to understand. Now, to finish this part of the call, let's just have a quick look at the politics side of stuff, because this is equally important and equally fascinating as part of 2025. We're keeping an eye on this hash race beyond race, right? It's frustrating as ever, because when you can see it and you realize, especially as it's reported through mainstream media, that you're being played, that it's frustrating. There's no question about it, it's frustrating. It's even more frustrating if you're living in the European Union right now, because if you're trapped inside that experimental, policy-driven, establishment-driven way of life, then you need to keep your eyes very, very wide open indeed. Right? We already know the grandmas that sit on the top of this structure who just do not have either any ambition to understand what's happening in India and Bhutan and the US and Japan and the UK. They have no ambition to understand it, which makes them ignorant, or they're complicit. And I still struggle with Lagarde and all these people who run the show in the European Union. I really struggle as to whether they're ignorant or complicit. I tend to veer towards the complicit side as elite globalists, where a lot of them come from. But it's shuddering for them to publicly announce in the last week through the ECB that they propose a channel to put retail savings. In other words, they're going to basically start taking people's savings under the guise of long-term savings that aren't really being used or not getting the best out of it that they should. They're going to take responsibility for your savings. That's the respect they have for you, and move them into capital markets and develop those markets to finance EU priorities. What are those EU priorities right now?
Military.
Arms race. So by rights, people should be up in arms about this. The problem with the European Union, it's even more difficult to shake out the hegemony than it is in the US Senate. And everybody in Europe knows that, apart from these idealists. Okay? And these talking heads, and they've hijacked the millennials with the purple hair and teenagers. The whole idea is you've got to be aware of this, because this is akin to, people having their long, hard-earned savings simply funneled into other areas under the guise of everybody needs to contribute to the European experiment. So the middle class, fortunately, we're aware of it. In fact, we're not just aware of it. The only way out of it is to move your funds out. Move your funds out. I don't mean out of Europe. I mean out of the system. Vote with your feet. That's my opinion on that. Because ironically, in other parts of the world, which have been under such subjugation for many, 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 many generations, they've been under all sorts of different rule, from royal to religion to despots to dictators, right? These guys are starting to look at this in their own and say, right, there's no need for top-down diktat. Let's provide a all-encompassing solution. Look at Bhutan. 40% of its GDP is now down to its Bitcoin reserve. And where's that Bitcoin reserve coming from? It's using the endless energy that exists up there in those mountains in the form of hydro energy to mine Bitcoin. What's not to get? And that gets redistributed to the population as a growing asset, just like they do in Norway. Yeah, the best, arguably the best sovereign reserve on the planet, because they did it with oil since the 1970s. They went against what I've just described, right? Clever people up there in Scandi. India's ruling party can't resist. Modi can't resist. Won't be Modi, it'll be people around him, but they're moving towards what they need to do. And countries as difficult and depressing as in South America, which has been put under the cosh for generations because of what went on with American influence, they've now decided to put Bitcoin on management, basically, because of the surges in their currency depreciation over the past few decades. Okay, so even Bolivia, Argentina's done the same. Argentina was in the doldrums forever and has moved to where it's moving. They're watching El Salvador, right? Positive stuff. The old man of Europe, we've got to watch it. US Fed rate cuts expected in the US. This must happen. It's 78% probability now. It was barely down to 20%. It's up in most part of this year, but Powell, his days are numbered, and it won't just be Powell, of course. They need to do this because the US can't afford its own debt. Trump's saying it explicitly on the bloody news. You never heard that. You never heard a president say we're in trouble, we need to reduce rates because we can't afford our own debt. You've never heard that. And now it's being put up. I mean, it's not even taken advantage, but the media, the talking heads, the editors, the people who read the news and report the news, they don't recognize the importance of that. They just talk over it. That's how ignorant they are. That's why you need to always seek financial education. And then just, again, a soundbite straight from the president, the most powerful, allegedly, individual on the planet. Just a soundbite, a throwaway comment in a press conference. Bitcoin takes pressure off the dollar. Bitcoin takes pressure off the dollar. I mean, it's just a gift, absolute gift. The governments, the bosses, the banks, the institutions, they're doing everything that needs to be done to market, if that's what you want to call it, our joint ownership of a globally connected balance sheet of 21 million. It's the gift. All we have to do is lean into it. All you have to decide is how quickly do you want to lean into it? And have you been leaning into it as much as you should have been doing? And are you going to lean into it as much as you need to do in order for you to get to where you want to be over this next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? It's sat there looking at us. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And then you've got executive orders, which is all the side stuff, getting rid of the debanking stuff, which is, again, wholly the opposite in Europe. And Japan, again, under the cosh for decades and decades and decades, looking to front run now this next generation of sound money by being one of the first to cut capital gain taxes, because where did capital gains ever come from on money? It's money. Everybody knows that's true. Everybody knows that's how current structures are set up. It's just a case of Bitcoin moving into that premise, which it will, because it's moving on to more and more and more treasuries, and off we go. It won't take much of that just to get a glimmer that capital gains are being relinquished in different countries and where are people going to start moving to, right? In order for Bitcoin to fly. That's what it's all about. Okay. So as ever, whatever shakes out here, this is just updates on updates on updates. This is on the positive end. You know, it's still difficult to navigate through. It's still a lot of information, but if you look at it on the premise of the consequences since 1971, that gives you enough energy to say, yeah, we cannot put up with those problems anymore. And I'm not going to put up with me getting to a point of life as a boomer or a Gen X and just floating through life, allowing these governments and policy advisors and institutions to borrow fake money in order for that to be paid back by my kids. One thing you can do is stand up yourself today and move yourself into sound money. That's what we do. That's what we stand for at DBM. That's what it's all about. That's not an easy journey. It takes a lot. It's easier together. You're stronger together. And you must work together to make sure you get the best out of what is in front of us and what has already been proven. That's the most amazing thing. This isn't a pipe dream or a hope. This is happening today, right now, in front of us. And our job is to be there for people who wish to take advantage of it. I'll see you on the next call.